It is 7 o'clock, and I want to welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Megan Cover, and I am head of school at GPS. And I'm delighted to be here along with our brother school, Macaulay, and on behalf of Macaulay, Lee Burns, head of school at Macaulay and GPS, we welcome you to an evening with Dr. Lisa Damour. This is the culmination, at least for GPS families, of our April kind of virtual parenting sessions. And so we're delighted that Dr. Damour is going to be the grand finale. And as we partner with parents while we navigate the important work of guiding students through adolescence, we are proud to share Dr. Damour's wisdom and insight with you. Dr. Damour is no stranger to GPS. She has been on campus twice, and we are so fortunate to have her here tonight so that we can make her expertise available to a wider audience. So welcome, Dr. Damour. Before we get started, and she probably does not need this introduction because everybody knows Dr. Damour. If you're like me, you have your books on your bedside table. She is the author of 3 New York Times bestsellers, Untangled, Under Pressure, and The Emotional Lives of Teenagers. She co-hosts the Ask Lisa podcast, works in collaboration with UNICEF, and is recognized as a thought leader by the American Psychological Association. She also maintains a private practice. Dr. Damour is a regular contributor to the New York Times and CBS News and the creator of Untangling 10 to 20, a digital library of premium content to support teens and those who care for them. She has written extensively about education and child development and speaks to schools and organizations around the world on the topics of child and adolescent development, family mental health, and adult well-being. A Yale University graduate, Dr. Damour worked for the Yale Child Study Center before earning her doctorate in clinical psychology at the University of Michigan. She has been a fellow at Yale's Edgar Zigler Center in Child Development and Social Policy and the University of Michigan's Power Foundation. She and her husband are proud parents of 2 daughters. So welcome, Lisa, and we're going to listen to Dr. Damour, and then we'll have some time at the end for some Q&A, which you can just put into the chat. And we'll listen to her great wisdom. So take it away, Dr. Damour.
Thank you. That's really a lovely introduction. I'll offer wisdom. We'll see if it's great. Well, you be the judge. But it's delightful to be back with you, and I'm thrilled that we can do this as a combined event across both schools. So I'm very glad to be here. And the age ranges that your 2 schools cover, like this is my sweet spot. I love teenagers. I've always loved teenagers. I've written 3 books about teenagers. I've cared for teenagers for 30 years at this point. I don't say this lightly. I don't know that I've seen a harder time in my time as a clinician to be a teenager or to raise one. There's a lot going on. We've been through a lot as families in recent years. And yet I don't feel grim or hand-wringing about this. And the reason for that is that the single most powerful force for adolescent mental health is strong relationships with caring adults. So the thing that really matters, the thing that makes a difference in terms of teenage mental health and teenage thriving is actually the very thing we have most control over, which is our relationships with teenagers. So what we're going to spend our time on is how we build those strong relationships with our adolescents, and especially how we do so around their very intense emotions that they feel. And that's actually one of the most true and natural and kind of perennial aspects of being a teenager is that you just have really intense emotions. Those can push us away from our kids, but they can also bring us closer if we handle them well. So that's what we're going to really focus on. Before getting into the nitty-gritty of how we help young people handle emotions well and how we use that to strengthen our relationships with them, I do want to take a beat and pause on the term mental health. I've already used it a couple of times. It's obviously what I think about all the time. And interestingly, the cultural conversation about mental health has become very, very central to a lot of our discourse. We talk about it a lot. Kids talk about it a lot. This is by and large a good thing. And certainly as a clinician, I'm glad that we're having this conversation. My only hesitation, which you can hear in my voice, is that often when people are talking, whether it's the media or in the popular discourse about mental health, they're not actually defining it accurately. They're not thinking about it the way we think about it as clinicians and researchers. And what I mean by that is that often you will hear being mentally healthy wrongly equated with feeling good. Like, you know you're mentally healthy, you know your kid's mentally healthy if there's a sense of feeling good or calm or relaxed or somehow at ease. All right, these are wonderful things. I want your kids to feel good. I want you to feel good. I want there to be periods where things feel really great. They're not mental health though. And I think it's pretty tricky if we use that as a definition of mental health, because as we all know, like good feelings come and go, or a day can start great and then something goes wrong and it's not a great day. And if we have equated mental health with feeling good, that's going to raise far more questions than we need about one's mental health. If we just start to think like as soon as we feel bad, we're worried about mental health. So I want us to work with a different definition, and it's the one that I really work hard to bring across in my most recent book, The Emotional Lives of Teenagers. And here it is. Mental health's about two things. It's about having feelings that fit the situation you are in, and then managing those feelings well. So having feelings that fit the situation means also sometimes having negative emotions. So if we think about it this way, let's say, okay, here we are, it's a Wednesday night. Let's say tomorrow, when your kid goes to school, let's say your kid has like a dear friend, like the person they just enjoy the most. They spend as much time with this friend as they can during the week. They hang out on the weekends. It's their person. And let's say, and this won't happen, but let's say tomorrow that kid comes to school and says to your kid, my family's moving over the summer. I just found out. We're moving to California. Okay. This is terrible news. Your kid will be very, very upset by this, and they should be. And the kid who rolls in the door tomorrow afternoon will be sad about their friend moving, at least, probably anxious about who they're going to hang out with, maybe mad at the kid's parents for making the move, right? There will be a whole bunch of negative emotions happening, all of which are totally appropriate to the situation. And in many ways, we should think of like not only not grounds for concern, actually proof of mental health, right? That if your kid's best buddy were moving and your kid were like, whatever, I don't care, that's more concerning, right? For the kid to come home upset about an upsetting thing is exactly what we expect to see. It's what we expect to see, and it's a sign that the kid works exactly as they should. So check on the first part of the definition of mental health, having feelings that fit the situation. Then we get to the second part of the definition, and this is really where the rubber hits the road, which is managing those feelings well. Managing those feelings in a way that brings relief and does no harm. So the kinds of things we would want to see in terms of managing the feelings well, and the kinds of things that teenagers do are things like, some kids will want to have a good cry. Psychologists like crying. Crying calms the central nervous system. It helps you feel better. It brings relief. It does no harm. It checks the box. Some kids are going to want to go for a run. Some kids, I had one teenage girl recently, she's like, oh, I just go home and I force cuddle my cat, right? So some kids are going to find the family pet and like have some time with the pet. Some kids are going to want their favorite foods, right? There's a huge range of things that kids do, and we'll come back to it. We'll come back to the gendered piece of this. But the bottom line is as long as the kid helps themselves feel better in a way that brings relief and does no harm, that's great. That's the picture of mental health. The only time we worry is if they go down another road, the other road, which is they get relief in a way that comes at a cost. So sometimes kids come home and they're like, okay, well, if I'm miserable, we're all going to be miserable, right? I'm taking you all down with me for a week and a half because I am so bummed out about what I just found out. Okay, they're not alone with the feeling, which is better for them, but it's not good for the relationships. Some kids manage things like this by collapsing in on themselves. Like, why do all bad things happen to me? Maybe if I were better or different, things would go better for me, right? So they're beating up on themselves and imagining a sense of control, but again, like at great cost. Some kids, when they're upset, they're like, you know what? I'm going to smoke a ton of weed until this feeling dies down. All right, it'll work. That's the problem with substances. It does bring some relief, but that's not how we want kids managing painful emotions. So the goal here, the job of the teenager is pretty straightforward. Have feelings that fit, even if they're negative feelings, and then manage those feelings in ways that are effective and harmless. That's all we're looking for. Okay, so that's their job. So if that's their job, what's our job? Where do we fit ourselves into this interaction? So I'm gonna sum up our job in 2 words, but I want you to file them under easy to say, very hard to do. And I myself am raising teenagers, and I can tell you, these are easy for me to say. I say them a lot, and I encourage other parents to do these things all the time. Very hard to do. Okay, our job when our kid's upset is to try to be a steady presence. That's it. That's our job. The longer I think about this, I also want to add, or to try to fake being a steady presence, because I think that is in truth a lot of what I'm doing in my own home. Okay, so our job is to try to be a steady presence. This is not easy, right? Kid comes in the house really upset about some really bad news. They've got their big, feelings. It's hard to be a steady presence. Okay, so let's unpack a little bit why it's hard. First, it is the big feelings. You have noticed with your teenagers that their emotions are far more potent than their emotions were when they were 8, 9, and 10. 8, 9, and 10-year-olds, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, usually pretty mellow, pretty easygoing. And then it all comes roaring back at 10 or 11. All the intensity that was there when they were little kids, it all comes roaring back in adolescence. And we find that teenage emotions are far more powerful than they used to be. And it's one thing when your toddler is having a tantrum and is overwhelmed by feelings, but they're still a little body and a little person. It's another thing when your 13 or 14-year-old is having a really, really big emotion and they are also now bigger people, and it can be pretty harrowing. And I think that that is part of what makes it hard to be a steady presence. I think another major factor in terms of the right now aspect of this, we have just been swimming in headlines about the adolescent mental health crisis now for years, like years at this point. It is worrisome, it is real. It also makes it, I think, very hard on parents to know when to worry. Um, I think all the time about, when I see these headlines, I think all the time, okay, what if this is your first teenager and they're having meltdowns like teenagers do, but you haven't seen this before? How do you not look at that and think, is this an adolescent mental health crisis, the kind I'm reading about in the paper all the time, or is this what I should be expecting in adolescence? So to help address that question, and just to really hopefully be reassuring, strangely, I find one of the most reassuring things I can offer is to tell you when I want you to worry. And I think there is something to that. Like if you know where the line is, right, and you're not at or over that line, you can probably relax. So let me tell you where the lines are. I want you to worry, not if your teenager's mood is all over the map, right? If it's doing this. That's what teenage moods do. I want you to worry if your mood goes to a dark or concerning place, your teenager's mood goes to a dark or concerning place and hangs out there. Um, they're grumpy, they're low, they're blank, they're crabby as all get out. For 36 hours can be a long time in the life of a teenager. You know your kid well, 24 hours may be very unlike them. We expect to see mood bumping around a lot. I want you to worry if your teenager's using what I call costly coping. So it's sort of what I've described already. They're coping, but they're coping in ways that actually come at a price, right? So they're using substances, or they're engaged in self-harm, or they're just terrible to themselves, or they're terrible to other people. We don't expect to see that. I want you to worry if emotions are in charge. Emotions are important. They weigh in, they help us make decisions, but they shouldn't be calling the shots. And to rest for a minute here on something that's really become quite a bit more prominent in recent years, an example of emotions calling the shots is kids using avoidance to manage anxiety. So anxiety is part of being a person. It's definitely part of being a teenager. And one thing that we have seen in the wake of the pandemic is a lot more use of avoidance to manage anxiety. Kids who are anxious about an upcoming test or a tricky day at school or going to a party, right? That is the kind of party you want your kid at. And managing that by just deciding to stay close to home and not go. The tricky thing about avoidance is this turns out to be a very costly way to cope. Um, and it puts anxiety in charge. And one of the things, if you remember, only a few things from tonight, remember this. It's a rule in psychology that avoidance feeds anxiety. And the way this works is that let's picture a kid who has a big test at school and is anxious about the test. So it's the morning of the test, they wake up, they are sick to their stomach. They're super uncomfortable, they don't want to go, they're worried about the test, they're nervous about it. They're like, please, please, please do not make me go. And you're like, okay, you're a mess, you don't have to go. All right, the first thing that's going to happen is instant relief. They're going to feel instantly so much better. Okay, we call this a reinforcing experience. They felt bad, they avoided, they felt better. What it means, if you remember from intro psych reinforcement studies, right? The next time they feel anxious, they're like, I know it helps me feel better. Let's go for some avoidance. They're more likely to avoid the next time. So that's one problem. A second way that avoidance feeds anxiety is that whatever the kid pictured about the test, however bad they thought it was going to be, however, huge and long it was going to be, that becomes the reality. They never went and checked out the test. They don't know what it looks like. So it's as bad as they daydream it to be, and you can daydream something to be pretty bad. The third issue, and this is very unique to teenagers especially, is that as soon as you don't go to school, or as soon as you don't go to the, fun party that everyone is at, and it's a good party to go to, you're kind of out of the loop. You fall out of the loop socially. If you don't go to school, you fall out of the loop academically, which makes it that much harder to turn around and go back. So avoidance is like a prime example of when to worry, which is kids are using coping strategies that are costly, right? So avoidance works, but it costs a lot. I'm going to spend more time on how we support and how we intervene, but since we're on this one, I actually want to just give you some guidance right now. If your kid is saying to you, I cannot go to that party, I cannot go to school, I cannot, like, let me stay home, don't make me do it. One way to try to move that conversation forward is to say to them, I hear you, here's what I need to know. Is it uncomfortable or is it unmanageable? Now, there are some kids who have full-blown anxiety disorders for which this is totally unmanageable. They cannot do it, and it would actually be cruel and unusual, right, to make them do it. If that's the case, get them to a good clinician. We are great at treating anxiety disorders, and we can give them tools to manage their anxiety so they can do whatever it is they're avoiding. If they say it's uncomfortable, you say, that we can work with, that we can work with, that you can withstand, that I can withstand. We need you to do it. And usually the way we have you manage avoidance is have them do as much as they can bear. Not as much as they like or as much as feels good, but as much as they can bear. They can be a bit uncomfortable. And so you might say, let's just get you to school and talk to the teacher about the test. Let's see what the story is, right? And, that's as much as we're going to ask of you right now. And it's okay if you're uncomfortable while we do it. And the goal with avoidance is to just not allow avoidance, help kids wade back in, even if they have to do it step by step by step. But I think our goal at home is to not set comfort as the standard for moving forward. Kids can move forward even while uncomfortable, and it's our job to help them know that they can do that. Okay. So I want you to worry if feelings are all over the map, or are lodged, not if they're all over the map, if they get stuck somewhere. I want you to worry if they're in charge. I want you to worry if coping is costly. Since we're talking about worries, let's talk about the biggest worry any of us have ever had, which is worries that our kids might hurt themselves. This is really, I know, awkward and painful to talk about, but it's so much better to take it head on. So among the very frightening headlines that we are confronting are occasionally headlines about teenage suicide, right? This is the most, scary thing any of us can think about. Here's where I can offer some reassurance. On this point, my field has total consensus about what we want you to do if you're worried about your kids' safety with themselves. What we want you to do is to just ask directly. And the way I would have you do it is to say something like, because of, and you have to give them some context, because you were so upset about that thing, because you haven't seemed like yourself for a couple of days, because you've been in your room for a couple of days. I need to ask you a question. Have you had any thoughts of harming yourself or ending your life? Just straight up ask. Okay. This is the right thing to do. This is a very scary thing to think about doing. And the reason adults tend to be reluctant is they're afraid they're going to give the kid the idea that the kid wasn't thinking about it, and then you bring it up and now they're thinking about it and somehow they're at more risk. So here's some things to know. First of all, teenagers know what suicide is. We're not introducing a new concept. Second, and this is critical, we have research showing that if a teenager is thinking about hurting themselves, they're really, really, really glad somebody asked. So this is what we know from the data. This is our advice. This has been the advice for a long time. I did have an experience a couple months ago at this point that was so important and generous and powerful along these lines that I want to share it with you. So I was in a meeting just like this one with a school in California, giving the same information to a group of parents, and a dad messaged me privately through the chat. And he said, I was that teenager. And it would have meant so much to me if somebody had asked, because it would have let me know that they could see how much pain I was in. So the advice is the advice. The generosity of that man to share his experience with me, like just in terms of conviction around like, this is the way we need to do this, like sort of steeled me in that. And I want you to have it too. Okay. So we've talked about the scariest possible thing. We've talked about when to worry. We've talked about how to manage avoidance. We've talked about uncomfortable versus unmanageable. Does this make it easier to be a steady presence, right? Like this is what we're aiming for. Can we get to be a steady presence? I would like to think it does, right? That the kid rolls in the house, upset as all get out. Can we be a steady presence? I think that we still, even with this knowledge base, we still run into a very real barrier here, which is that I don't think there's anything more core and universal to being a parent than the fact that we hate to see our kids in pain. Like, that's just what it means to be a loving parent or caregiver, right? The kid you love comes in the house, they are in pain. Every cell in our evolutionary bodies is like, how do I make that stop, right? We're just built to get between our kids and distress. Like, that is what we are built to do. And I remember, so my girls are 20 and 13, and I remember when they were little, and they'd get those like really, really lousy colds, and they're like, their nose is running and they're hacking and they're kind of gross. And I remember looking at them and thinking, I would so much rather have your cold than watch you have your cold, right? Like I can manage the symptoms myself so much more comfortably than watching you have the symptoms. And then of course, eventually you always do have the symptoms yourself, like you do get the cold. But I also remember thinking, I have never looked at any other human being in my whole life and thought I would prefer to have your cold than watch you have it, right? That it is so fundamental to parenting that we don't want to see our kids suffer in any way. So when the kid comes in the door full of upset feeling or calls us on the phone full of upset feeling, everything in us is going to want to make it stop. Okay, make it stop is not steady presence. Make it stop is what happened? Here's some advice. How do I fix it? Who should I call? Right? All loving, all well meaning, not steady presence. So to get to the place of being or faking being, I'm really at this point holding myself just like if I can fake it well enough, faking being a steady presence, we have to allow for distress. We have to allow for the fact that our kids are going to get upset. And so I want to give us some reasons why we have to allow this. And I'm even going to push it. We actually have to embrace this, right? That our kids are going to be in pain sometimes emotionally, and we have to get behind it. All right, which is a bananas thing for a mother and psychologist to say, but here's the case I'm going to make. Okay, first of all, and I've mentioned this, I use this as a check when I'm trying to hold myself steady. Often their negative emotion is proof of mental health. So when one of my girls is upset about something and I can feel myself wanting to jump in and make it, fix it, do whatever I can usually slow myself down if I think, is this a reaction that is entirely appropriate to what occurred, right? Lost a contest that she was really invested in, friend is being a jerk, whatever it is my kid's upset reaction exactly the reaction that makes sense in this context. If I can say yes to it, which frankly, I've never said no to it. I mean, the reactions do fit. I have to make space for it. They're allowed to have reactions that fit what is happening. And we have to allow them to do that. Okay, so that's one thing. A second reason why we need to make room for negative emotions is that negative emotions, actually all emotions, are informational. They tell us how things are going. And so if there's a kid who every time your kid hangs out with them, your kid feels awful afterwards, your goal is not to help your kid feel better. Your goal is to help your kid reflect on the fact that they feel so crummy every time they hang out with this kid and maybe stop hanging out with this kid. Getting between your kid and that uncomfortable emotions is not doing them any favor, right? They need to feel the feeling and make different choices. Emotions are also growth giving, especially I think the negative ones. And I think here I had this boy in my practice years ago. He was a 15-year-old boy, and he got caught cheating at school. And he totally did it. Like there was no question this kid had done it. And his school and his family did the best job of making him face the consequences of the choice he had made. I was one of those consequences. This kid gets stuck in my office. And so we're working things through in my practice. He is miserable. This is not fun for him. And I remember one day we're in a session and he's just so bummed out about all of this. And he gets this kind of faraway look on his face. He looks out my window and he's like, I never want to feel like this again. And I remember being like, bingo, right? Like this is exactly what's supposed to happen here. Like this kid's moral development is flourishing on the back of being made to feel uncomfortable emotions, helped to feel uncomfortable emotions. Okay, so those are several reasons. I'm going to give you one more reason why we have to work towards allowing negative emotions in our kids, why we have to be steady in the face of them. Okay, here it is. This is the big one, really. Our kids' ability to tolerate discomfort rests on our ability to tolerate their discomfort. So the kid who comes home with bad news, the kid who calls with bad news, and if the bad news is their like dear friend is moving away, it's going to feel like the end of the world. When they share that information with us, they are watching for our reaction. And what they are checking is this as bad as it feels to me? Is this as end of the world feeling as it feels to me? If we leap into action, we can fix it. We'll get you on a plane. I'll call their family. We'll get it, that loving, not steady presence reaction basically communicates, oh, this is bad. I don't want you to have this feeling. I can't tolerate you having this feeling. We're going to fix this feeling. Well-meaning, not the most useful thing we can do. If instead we can hold it together and be a steady presence, if we can say, oh man, that stinks. That stinks. Right? If we can just offer empathy, be steady, right? So present with empathy, steady, we're doing nothing else. What we are communicating is, I see it, and I think you can take it, and I can take it. Doesn't mean we like it, but doesn't mean we can't withstand it. This is what they need us to communicate to them, that we know that they can withstand a degree of discomfort. Okay, why do they need this? Why do we want to invest our kids with the belief that they do not have to be afraid of negative emotions, that they can work with negative emotions? Why do they need this? Okay, this is big. This is big. They need it because it's what gives them freedom in the world. It's what opened the world up to them. And what I mean is that the kid who knows they can withstand some discomfort can do all sorts of things, right? They can be like, all right, I heard about the summer program. I might not meet anybody there, might not know anybody there, but if I'm lonely, I'll deal. Like, I'll just deal. I can deal with lonely. Or they might be like, I want to get this job. I've heard one of the bosses is kind of a jerk, but I really want the job. Okay, if the boss is a jerk and I don't like it, I can take it. I can take it, right? They have options, they have choices. The flip of it is, if a kid is like, I don't do well with uncomfortable emotions, or I am frightened of uncomfortable emotions, they can't do so much. These are the kids, and I've cared for more of these in recent years, where they're like, I'll do it if it's guaranteed to be great. Okay, there is almost nothing in life that we can say it's going to be 100% great. And there's definitely nothing really worth doing that we can say it's going to be 100% great. So I think about what we're up to, right, as adults, as the loving adults around these kids, and why we put them in these beautiful schools and what we want for them. We're doing it to give kids opportunity, right? I think about that all the time. Like, what's the universal that we are doing as parents? We're trying to give our kids opportunities. And the longer I do the work, the more clear it becomes to me that all hinges on their ability to work with painful emotions, to not be frightened of them and not feel they have to avoid them. Okay, so I'm now going to say we're all universally okay with the idea of our kids being in emotional pain, which of course we're not, but for the sake of argument, let's say we got there. Okay, here's where things get good. That does not mean our kids have to sit there and stew in discomfort. I don't want that for your kids. I don't want that for my kids. Here's where we turn to the much more fun part, which is helping them manage emotions well. So, when we come to the question of managing emotions well, what pops up for psychologists are actually two categories. Sometimes we manage emotions well by expressing them. Teenagers will almost universally say, like, getting your feelings out. And sometimes we manage emotions well by taming them, by reeling them in, by bringing them back under control. In the eyes of psychologists, these are equally valuable experiences, right? Expressing and taming, both important, both necessary. In the culture right now, we are super into getting kids to express, and that's where we put our energies. Okay, that's not a bad thing, but I want to share. I do a lot of interviews. I'm with a lot of journalists, and it's almost always at some point in the interview, they'll be like, okay, so Dr. Damour, how do we get teenagers to talk about their feelings, right? Which is a totally fair question, and I do answer it. But every time I get that question, I have this like flashback moment to like 20 years and 6 months ago when I was like 8.5 months pregnant with my first kid. So I've been practicing for a little while. I was with a bunch of senior colleagues. I was saying goodbye. I was going to go on maternity leave. So I'm sort of like packing up my bag. I'm shutting it all down. I'm almost out the door. And one of my senior colleagues, Debbie, who's still a dear friend, she was like, Lisa, do you want me to tell you how psychologists mess up their kids? And I was like, yes, I've seen those kids. I know exactly what you're talking about. And she said, they talk about feelings too much. And as soon as she said it, I was like, "Oh, yeah," I could see it, like, the kid's having a meltdown, and the psychologist parent is going, "Oh, I see you're having a big mad feeling now," whatever they're doing. And while I'm thinking about this, Debbie says, there comes a point in parenting where we say, "Okay, you've been upset for a while. What's gonna help you feel better?" And, like, she just, like, summed it all up, right? You've expressed a while, not helping you feel better. What's gonna help you bring this back under control? So that's how we think, expressing and taming, expressing and taming. So we're going to talk about how we help kids express, how we help kids tame. But before we get there, I actually want to talk about how they do it on their own. Um, if there's anything I've learned in caring for teenagers, it's that they are inventive, they are resourceful, they're figuring a lot out. And before I wade in or we wade in to try to intervene, I think it's really, really important to stand back and admire how they do things themselves and support what they're already up to. So when it comes to expressing, so we're just going to stay in these categories, expressing and taming. There's lots of ways that teenagers express emotions. One is that they will just verbalize. They will say, I feel anxious, I feel angry, I feel upset, I feel, fill in the blank. We've never had a generation that we're raising that was better at it than this group is, right? In terms of naming feelings. Um, this is what we are talking about all the time. Like, how do we get kids to talk about feelings? Why don't kids talk about feelings? They do talk about feelings. Okay. So then here to me is like the great irony. So all day long, we're like, we need to get teenagers talking about feelings. Okay. True confessions in my own house. If it is 9 p.m., if I'm trying to shut things down, if I'm still trying to catch the last episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm and I'm like making a beeline for the television and then I'm intercepted by a teenager who's like, hi, I feel anxious, frustrated, upset, or whatever. I wish I were like, good job. Usually I'm like, really? Like now? Why? Right? So I think it's this funny thing of like we want teenagers to talk about feelings until they start talking about their feelings, in which case we're like, why are you talking about so many feelings? Right? Like at least that's my experience, even as a psychologist. So here's how I try to be better in these moments, which is we know that the mere act of talking about a feeling helps to bring relief. It actually makes a person feel better. The person who says, I feel anxious, suddenly feels less anxious. The person who says, I feel angry, feels less angry. Like there's value in the words themselves. And so when I'm not necessarily instinctively bringing my A game as a parent, right? I really try to remember this, that like, you know what? The fact that she is telling me she already feels anxious, upset, afraid, she's done the work. And my job is to actually mostly just empathize and endorse and support. And that usually gets kids what they need. Okay, so those are the verbal strategies. One of the things I loved about writing this book is it put me much more in touch with all of the nonverbal ways that kids express. And I will say that boys as a group are well represented in the nonverbal expression of emotion. We cultivate verbalization in we ask them about their feelings, they talk with each other about their feelings, they talk with their mothers about their feelings. Like there's a lot of practice that goes on, less so for boys, just out of socialization. It doesn't have to be this way, but it is this way. Boys still express feelings a lot and in adaptive ways. So boys will use their bodies. I mean, girls do this too. This isn't just exclusive to boys, but in terms of some of the gender differences we see. Perfect example I had a mom of a 17-year-old. She was like, "Ugh, we're having a problem. My kid's schedule changed. He used to come home and play basketball for an hour to blow off steam, and then he would settle down and do his homework. He lost the basketball hour and now he's having a hard time doing his homework." And she said it like blow off steam, like use his body to discharge the frustration of the day, right? This is great. This is not second best. As long as it brings relief and does no harm, it's wonderful. And I think that we sometimes blow right past that. Another thing that I will say I will see equally across genders is teenagers using music as a way to get expressive relief. I am fascinated by this. Teenagers all have playlists. Many of them have playlists with feelings names attached to them. My number one hobby right now is collecting the names of the playlists that they will share with me. And I promise you, if I'm in a co-ed environment, boys and girls equally are sharing along these lines. So the kinds of playlist names I've recently gotten, from a boy, he had a playlist called Grrr. Was the name of the playlist. I had a girl tell me she had a pure feminist rage playlist. I had a boy tell me he had a playlist. This one's funny actually. He was like, it's called Low Key Devious. I was like, what's your Low Key Devious playlist about? He's like, it's when I want to be naughty, but I don't want to get in trouble. Yeah. They have sad playlists. They have playlists with emojis, actually, kind of indicating the nature of the playlist. They have calm down playlists, they have pump up playlists. And what they do, and we've actually backed this up in the lab, they go find the playlist that matches the mood they're trying to work through. So an angry kid goes and listens to his grr playlist, gets angrier, and actually feels better faster. It actually speeds him through and out of the emotion. A sad kid goes and puts on a sad playlist, may purposely cry, just to sort of have that feeling and catalyze it out and through. So they're brilliant. I mean, this is a brilliant solution, and teenagers are using it all the time to, find a way through painful emotions and express and get them out. And again, I think about this, like the ironies of caring for teenagers, like, they're using music to create these perfectly curated playlists that they go to when they're having a mood that they can't quite express, and then they listen to the music and the music helps them feel better and they come out of it better. And the adults are standing around going, why are they on their phones? You're like, they're doing this genius thing that is so adaptive, and like, what more could we want from them sometimes? So those are some of what teenagers do for expression. Teenagers also tame emotions. They bring them back under control. Couple categories for how they do this. One is through comforting themselves. Teenagers will come home, or come to the end of a long day, and if they're in a lousy mood, one of the number one things they tell me they do is they go back to bed. They just, like, get in their bed. I mentioned they find their pets, they love their foods, they love their comfort foods. I will hear from boys especially about, the fast food that they love that helps them feel better after a lousy day. Um, they take showers, they take baths. I know that there's, like, a whole skincare situation going on right now that's a little over the top. Um, I get it, that it's a lot. I also and this is sort of the long view on having cared for teenagers, there's a lot teenagers can do to take the edge off, like, they could also just go smoke a bunch of marijuana, so, like, skincare routine, I'm like, I can live with it, I can live with it. Um, so they use comforts. They also use distractions. They will distract themselves when they're upset. So this is an interesting one, because we don't love it as adults, right? We sort of feel like focus is good, distraction is bad. Um, I've sort of come around a bit on this. I think we all use distractions. I know I use distractions when frustrated or having a feeling I don't want to have. Many times a day, I will be working on a piece of writing or some frustrating email I've got to come up with. I'll start working, it's not going great, I can feel my tension rising, I'm pretty much ready to slam my computer shut. But if I just go do a little internet shopping, I can usually find my way through it, get to an okay place, hop back and do my work, right? Like, I think we're all doing this all the time. Check the scores, whatever it is, like something just to give us a moment of relief. It's not a bad thing on its own. It is tricky in that so often our teenagers are turning to social media when they need a quick distraction. And the problem with social media is that it's not designed to be a quick distraction. The nature of the algorithms is that these are giant equations with an ungodly amount of data on our kids and us, making choices about what to put in front of your kid that will be impossible to not look at next. And so all the time, kids are like, I'm just gonna look at my phone for a second because I'm frustrated about something. And then 25 minutes later, they're like, oh, I lost more time than I meant. This is not willpower issues. This is not a character question. This is all of Silicon Valley versus your kid. So distraction's okay. And I now talk about it with teenagers in terms of dosing. Same with video games. Video games are fine. They're very, very distracting. Sometimes kids need a distraction. The problem with video games is also how they're engineered. They're engineered not so that you feel like you lost, but so that you feel like you almost won, and then you want to keep going. And so um, I think we can have really productive conversations with teenagers about technology and using it for distraction if we don't blame them for the fact that it's so hard to control it sometimes. If we talk about that as being inherent to these technologies and offering ourselves as a partner and making sure they get the kind of dose of distraction that's gonna make things better, not worse for them. Okay, here at last we come to the question of like, how do we help? How do we help support them? So staying and expressing, staying and taming as these categories. So expressing, if your kid's a talker, this is easy, right? Because they're talking. Like this is exactly what we want them to do. And again, I'll just say, start with empathy, right? Just empathizing when a kid's upset. Usually that's all they want. Often it's all we've got, right? We can't fix it. But just being like, oh, I'm so sorry, or of course you're upset, or man, that stinks, or anyone in your shoes would be angry or worried or anxious or, fill in the blank about this. That is what they want. They want to be heard, they want reassurance. We have really cool data. I cite this in my book showing that kids whose parents, adults, caregivers can respond with empathy on a regular basis, they have a lower inflammatory response, which is actually a beautiful biological marker of just overall stress. Um, so like empathy is powerful, like far more powerful than we give it, I think, credit for. Then there's the kids who are not big talkers. These kids are trickier. What I can tell you is that my experience is that kids who are not big talkers are sometimes talkers, but it tends to be at wildly inconvenient times. And I discovered this with my older daughter, who's not a big talker. And the way this became clear to me is that, we would be at dinner and I'd be like, how was school? And she'd say, fine. And I'd say, what happened? And she'd say, nothing. right? I'd be like, okay. And then we'd finish dinner and then we'd sort of clean it up and everybody would go their separate ways. And then like cut to 10 p.m. and I'm in bed and I've got my novel and I'm shutting it down and I'm at the finish line. And then she would be standing several nights a week right next to my side of the bed, talking and talking and talking. And I was like, what are we doing? And then I started sharing this and realized like, this is not that rare. This is not that rare. And so then I was like, okay, well, this is interesting then. Like, what's the story? So here's what I'm sure it's all about. Teenagers are organized around autonomy. It's their job to be self-determining. And I think at dinner, when I say, how was school, what happened? I'm basically calling the meeting and setting the agenda. And my kid's like, I don't have to come to this meeting, which she doesn't. And I think she's also like, I did meetings like this all day, which she did. So if she waits till I'm in bed and then comes for the conversation, okay, first of all, she's called the meeting. I didn't even know we were having a meeting. We're having a meeting. We're having the meeting. Secondly, she's setting the agenda. And I've actually had teenagers say to me, late at night, like my parents, they don't ask so many questions and they don't bring up new topics. And I'm like, of course we don't, because we're trying to go to sleep. And then if I do ask questions or if I do try to bring up a new topic, all she has to do to end the meeting is just say, I'm gonna let you sleep. And she's out, right? And I'm not getting up, you're not getting up for the follow-up question, right? We're gonna let it go at that point. So they're brilliant. They want to connect with us, they want total control. Make it work, right? They're not with us that long if they're in your home, right? And it's worth it to connect, even if it means getting in bed earlier. Just to have those moments really are powerful. Okay. Then we have here at last the question of like taming and helping kids control emotions. We can comfort our kids. You should all know what comforts your kid. If it's a particular TV show that they have a lot of nostalgia for, or, a favorite meal, or, going for a walk with the dog, getting outside, like whatever it is, it just helps them feel better. This is not second best to them talking and expressing. Comforting and taming is really important. I think the trick with teenagers is that sometimes we feel like I can only help you if you tell me what's wrong. Like I can see you're upset and I need to know what's wrong in order to be of help. I don't think that's a fair transaction to ask teenagers to make. There are plenty of times when teenagers just don't want to talk about what's wrong. There's lots of reasons for this. I'll give you one. I love this. Years ago, I was with a group of teenagers and I'm like, what's the deal, right? You're upset, you're not sharing. And this one girl said, she said, well, sometimes by the time I get home, I'm like 90% of the way over it. And talking with my folks about it is not going to help me feel better. It's brilliant, right? But we can still comfort that kid through that last 10% without knowing what's wrong. The last thing, I'm just going to open a huge can of worms here at the end. Sleep's a huge factor in being able to tame and control emotions. We know this as parents, right? We know this the minute we become parents, right? The toddler who has missed their nap is a disaster. The teenager who is under arrested is a disaster. We need to protect sleep. Teenagers, high schoolers need an average of 9 hours of sleep a night. Middle schoolers need an average of 10. Younger kids need more than that. A lot gets in the way for them around their sleep. Biggest factor probably for a lot of kids that's negotiable is where their technology is. I'm not a fan of technology being in bedrooms really ever, and certainly not at night. If it's not an issue for your kid, you don't have to go wrest it out of their room. If you have any reason to think their tech is keeping them up, I think it's time for a serious conversation about if they want it in their room, it cannot be a factor in disrupting their sleep or it's coming out. Okay, I'm gonna wrap us up. Let me just say this. We don't like for our kids to be in emotional pain because we love them. It can make us inclined to fight it or fix it. Let us see instead, though, if we can make space for them to feel discomfort. And make space for the very specific reason of that gives us a chance to see how they're doing with developing the skill set for managing painful emotions, tolerating painful emotions. And it gives us a chance to help them learn how to manage and tolerate painful emotions. And this is a skill set that they need right this minute. And it's also a skill set that they're gonna be drawing on and find absolutely necessary for the rest of their lives. Thank you.
Dr. Damour, thank you so very much. I could listen to you for hours and hours, and this is why I have your books on my bedside table, because I find myself opening to certain chapters and taking your advice. I wanted to offer to the audience right now, if you have any questions for Dr. Damour, if you want to put them in the chat and we can ask her, or I will ask her, um, anything at all. So, um,
I see one. Do you see that one?
oh, I do. Thank you.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Do you want to read it?
Sure. Would love to hear your thoughts on the place of cell phones in schools, especially middle schools. Um, they seem to be driving avoidant and deviant behaviors across the board during school hours, socially, academically, etc.
Yeah. Um, I'm not a big fan of phones in schools. Um, I will say a lot of where this comes from, I feel like I have to like true confessions. My husband's a high school teacher, and he's a really dedicated high school teacher. And he's at a high school actually where the boys check their phones on the way into class, like have to turn them in. And even still, he's like, it's so disruptive to learning. It is so hard for them to focus on what we're doing. All they're thinking about is their phone and how fast they can get to it. And he's taught 30 plus years, so he's was doing this for a long time before this was an option. And I think about like, well, we want them focusing on learning during the day. I also think about the fact that like during the day they're safe, right? And if we need to reach them, we can. And one of the big questions that people ask, and I think it's a really important one, is digital technology getting in the way of kids learning how to manage feelings, right? That as soon as they're uncomfortable, if they hop on their phone, does that get in the way? And the answer is yes, it does, right? But if they have to have 7 to 8 hours a day where that's not an option for how to manage a feeling, they will build that muscle just fine. Because if there's one thing that's true about schools, it gives kids a lot of chances to manage distress, right? A lot will rub a kid the wrong way in the course of a day. And so there, I think on balance, it's better to not have a phone in the school day.
Mhm. Lisa, to follow up on that, is it almost like we need to give them, if we set those boundaries, it's like giving them permission to be off of their phones,
Yes,
right?
kids who go to summer camps where they take the phones for 2 weeks,
Mhm.
love it, love
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
And so I think if everybody did it all at once, right? None of your classmates have it either. It gets a lot easier. And, and that's a long stretch for kids to go without their phones. And they'll do a lot of learning and growing in that 8 hours a day.
yeah. Okay, we have a couple more questions here.
Right.
One is, how do you determine when a child is struggling with ADHD or anxiety, and how can you explain um, how these are comorbid or related to me as a parent?
Okay. So they are often comorbid. They do run together. So what you need is a really, really good evaluation. And I am sure the people at your schools know who the good evaluators are in your community. There are people who do a lousy job who will charge you a lot of money. There are also people who do a good job who will also charge you a lot of money. But don't just go in the phone book. Like get the schools know who's doing the right reports and doing a good job with it. And you do want to get this evaluated. And a good evaluation will tease apart ADHD, anxiety, and make treatment recommendations for one or both. Um, if you want a much deeper dive on this, go to my podcast or my website. We within this season did an episode on how do I, what do I do if I think my kid has ADHD? And it's 30 minutes of, here is the systematic process of going through and sorting this out. Just so you know, if you go to my website, which is drlisadamour.com, drlisadamour.com, it says start browsing, click that, you can sort podcast, and then there's 6 categories, and just mental health is where you're going to find ADHD and anxiety. So you can find tons and tons of free resources there.
Wonderful. Here's another one. Love the message of sitting in discomfort. learning from failure and persistency. How can we be intentional on exposing our kids to some uncomfortable situations where they can learn?
Get them a job. I have to tell you, I feel like getting a job, and not a fun job. I mean, fun jobs should be a little bit fun, but not some cushy internship, like a job where you have to work with the public. I have never seen anything round out a kid's maturation like a real job. First of all, they love making money, and that's wonderful and powerful, but also having to deal with all the discomfort of having a boss, having customers, having, people come to the restaurant where you're working. Jobs are the best thing for teenagers.
They really are. My oldest worked in a hair salon,
Yeah,
and it was an amazing, of anything that she learned, I will say, it was an amazing transformation. She loved getting a paycheck. She loved the beginning and the end and being productive. So I
yeah,
hear
and then having to deal with a very wide range of people who are not always actually that pleasant, and especially not to teenagers.
Mhm.
Um, I will say my older daughter worked in a retail store starting high school sophomore. When
Mhm.
I think about her preparation for college, I would say half of it I would chalk up to her high school, the other half I would chalk up to the job.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Getting a job.
Get a job.
Um, okay, let's hear. This is another one. Um, how about a teenage boy? There's not a question with this, but maybe comment on this, who thinks everyone dislikes him which is actually self-actualizing.
Mm, yeah. So I'll say they don't like me before they decide they don't like me, and then when they don't like me, I already saw it coming.
Hmm.
Um, so there's not a ton to go on in this question, but here's something I will say that may be useful here and maybe more generically. Kids sometimes say stuff that's just not true and that's very mean about themselves, right? Like everybody hates me, or I'm no good, or, I'm never gonna get, you know, what I want or things, whatever. And it's easy as a parent to sort of try to talk them out of that. Be like, but that's not true. And here's all the evidence to the contrary. And then they're like, but you don't see it, you don't get it. So, one ninja move to have in your repertoire is to say, okay, I don't think that's true, but it must be awful to feel that way. And that can actually keep you in connection. So, if he's like, everybody hates me, you might say, I don't think it's that everybody hates you, but and they don't even know you that well. But like, how awful to feel that way, buddy. Like, I hate that you feel that. That can start to move things a little bit. The other thing I will say, you have two wonderful schools that your kids go to. These are adults who watch kids all day, watch your kid all day. They have a lot of information about how kids are operating and how your kid is operating in the context of all that. If you're worried about your kid's social skills or socializing, call, discreetly and be like, I'm anxious about this. How anxious should I be? And they have a lot of information and can be useful.
Piggybacks on this a little bit. But how about some suggestions for tools to get a non-communicator who also is a boarding school student, boy, to communicate more?
Texting is the best thing that ever happened. Um, I love texting with my college age kid. It's perfect. Um, so I think some low key texts, right? Like, hey, we're thinking of you, checking in, give me a thumbs up, thumbs down, how's everything going? Send an emoji, right? Like, we love you, we're missing you. Like, could you just give us a read on how you are? Um, it gives kids time, it gives them space. They can control the pace of the conversation. And I think they're more likely to do it if they feel like we'll just leave it at text. You won't use this as an opening to try to have a deep conversation with me when you see me, that like texting is where this can happen. I will also tell you texting is not second best, right? I think we have this like sense that like if we're really having the conversation, it's, over the kitchen table, face to face over, a mug of tea. That's not what teenagers do. Expression is expression is expression. If a kid is letting you know how he feels by text, take it. I love it.
We have got time for one more question. So, how about this? What if your daughter appears constantly anxious about just normal life to the point where her default is to stay in bed reading for as long as we will allow it, and the self-soothing? And this is her safe space. We have lots of proof that when she engages in life, friends and everything, she enjoys it, but getting her to engage is often overwhelming.
Mm. Um, so if it's starting to become a barrier, right? If her anxiety is so intense and it's, avoidance is an issue, have her work on skills to manage her anxiety so she can not avoid so much because of the exact snowballing thing I said about avoidance and anxiety. The other thing I will say, and this is a great place to wrap up, teenagers feel things very intensely. So if you're like, you should go do this, and she's like, like right out of the gate, like, no, bad. One wonderful strategy is to say, I know that's your first reaction. It's okay. That can be your first reaction. I'm gonna hang out, see if there's a second reaction. And sometimes just that little space, right? You're not fighting them on their first reaction. She may very instinctively be like, I know where I want to be. I want to be in my bed. Can create enough space where she's like, all right, fine. Take it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining. Thank you so much, Dr. Moore. I hope you enjoy your dinner with your children or child. And we are so grateful to your expertise and wisdom. And everyone, please check out Dr. Damour's podcast or any one of her 3 books. And such a pleasure and an honor to have you here. Have a
Thank
wonderful
you
evening.
so much. Thank you so much. Good
Thanks so
night.
much, Dr. Damour.
You're welcome. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hi, Lisa. Thank
Bye,
you.
Katie. Good to see you.
Too.
Take care.
Yeah,
Bye.
this was fun.
Have a good night.